Hi, everyone.
Okay.
It's Stephanie with the patient story, and I'm really thrilled to be able to introduce today's guest, Tim, who has graciously agreed to share his story with us on, what happened when you, Tim, got diagnosed with mantle cell lymphoma, which is really rare, right?
Yes, that's right. I think there's about 400 or 500 people in the UK diagnosed with it every year, and a couple of thousand so over in the US.
That's right. That's right. And I was really, I kind of went on a limb, tried to get a hold of Tim, and he was really, really wonderful in agreeing to share his story.
Oh, you're welcome.
Thank you, Tim. First I want to ask, I mean, you look great. So how are you doing now?
Yeah, not too bad at all. I'm just over 2 years past the sort of the end of the sort of big treatment, which was the stem cell transplant, and I've been having sort of maintenance shots every couple of months or so since then. And as far as I'm aware, I'm still in remission. I've actually got a call with my consultant tomorrow, so so I guess I'll find out whether I'm as good as I think I am at the moment. But yeah, it's I'm doing well, thank you.
That's wonderful. And you feel good. I mean, it seems like your energy is great. And I'd love to talk
Yeah,
about this at the very end, this whole,
sure.
waiting for the call, always wanting to hear that news. But first,
Of course.
why don't we dive right in? I know with mantle cell lymphoma, it's a bit different because
Mm.
the symptoms often are pretty slow. Uh,
Yeah,
so why don't you describe? I know it started really a few years ago.
it did. Yes.
Yeah, if you could describe the first symptoms.
Yeah, sure. I mean, it was sort of something and nothing really. So I was 50 when I was diagnosed, and um, my wife and I, we'd with work, had actually won a trip over to Hawaii, and which is over to Maui, which is a long way to go for someone like myself. And we just stood in the bathroom one night, and sort of shaving, getting ready to sort of go down to dinner, and I was sort of complaining about a very, very small lump on the side of my neck. I mean, not much bigger than probably a pea or something like that, but it was sort of getting in the way of my razor, and I sort of said something probably unprintable about it, and my wife had a look and said, "Oh, you probably ought to go and see the GP when we get back home about that." I said, "It's probably nothing. It's probably just sort of a cyst or something like that, because I've had a few in the past, but on my back, and it looked similar and sort of felt the same. Sort of no pain there or anything like that." So when we got home, sort of early June, went and saw my general practitioner, and he referred me to the local hospital pretty quickly. In fact, there and then, he sort of said, "Well, it's probably nothing, but we ought to get you checked out." And yeah, so it really went from there. So yeah, it would have been sort of early June 2014, I think. It's 2014, yes, 2014. Went and saw the specialist at the hospital, and they did initially sort of a thing called a needle biopsy on the lump to see what it was. And that came back positive for a non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, and at that point they didn't know what it was. So a couple of weeks after that result came back, I went in for what they call an excision biopsy, which is where they actually sort of put you under general anaesthetic and remove the lump or part of the lump from the neck. And that was all done in a morning, and got the results back a week or two later, which confirmed that it was mantle cell lymphoma, which was odd because, as you said earlier, it's a pretty rare type of non-Hodgkin lymphoma, and there's only sort of 400, 500 people a year diagnosed with it in the UK. My mother-in-law, my wife's mother, happened to have been one of them a few years previously.
Wow.
So she's also had MCL and been treated successfully for it as well. So that, sort of gives you a fair bit of confidence that that it is that it is treatable, and
Yes.
that sort of people do come out at the other end.
Right.
But I remember my consultant telling me with my wife that that's what I'd got, and Jane saying, "But that's what my mother had. He nearly fell off his chair."
Oh,
The odds of sort of two people having it that sort of knew each other, let alone within the sort of same sort of extended family, are sort of vanishingly rare. I think he sort
what
of,
are the
I, I,
odds?
yeah, I think he suggested that I do the lottery for him or something like that. I can't quite remember the conversation, but it was yeah, that was kind of the that was kind of the tone of the initial conversation.
Right.
But yeah,
And
so that's how I was diagnosed, I was fortunate in that the GP that I saw was relatively newly qualified, and sort of, suspected that there was possibly something more to the lump than what it initially appeared to be, I guess.
right, right. And Tim, so thanks for bringing us through that. And you can
Mm.
see the pictures on your screen,
I
right?
can, yes.
Okay. And so those were pictures you sent that helped to show what it was starting to look like, that lump.
Yeah. So the one on the right hand side of the screen is one that was taken actually as a Christmas present. It was taken by a professional photographer, so that would have been taken in December 2015, so about a year or so after the first sort of diagnosis. And the one on the one on the left is a selfie of myself and my wife. It was taken at about the same time. It was taken on the same sort of holiday. We were away for Christmas and the New Year. And actually, the one on the left is somewhat clearer at that point. You can sort of see the extent of the lump on
Right.
the left hand side of the neck, which is probably at that stage, it's probably 3 centimeters, an inch and a half across. And it was basically something that was just growing gradually, certainly throughout the first sort of 2 or 3 years after diagnosis.
Right.
Um, MCL is one of these odd lymphomas, in that normally when people talk about lymphoma, they talk about them as being either low grade or high grade. So high grade tends to be fairly rapidly growing, and actually, because they're rapidly growing, they need treating straight away, and they're usually okay to treat. Low grade are ones that can rumble along for years without really needing any treatment, but are usually harder to cure.
Mhm.
Mantle cell lymphoma is what they call intermediate, so it sits between the two. So sometimes it acts as a high grade lymphoma and needs treating really, really quickly. Other times it acts indolently or very, very slowly, like a low grade lymphoma.
Right.
And so actually the best course of action there is to wait until it becomes more of a problem.
Right. And I
And
know that's what ended up happening with you with the weight loss.
yes, it was.
Before we go into that, you had mentioned a few things you had to undergo for tests to
Yeah.
finally get to the first non-Hodgkin lymphoma diagnosis, and then
Mhm.
specifically mantle cell. So I
Yeah.
wanted to, we don't have to spend too much time, but I know you saw your GP or equivalent of primary care here in the
Yeah.
US, who referred you immediately to head and neck. And
Yes.
after that point, there was the needle biopsy, your
Yeah.
MRI, and that's what led to the non-Hodgkin lymphoma diagnosis. Do
That's
you
right.
have a quick sort of explanation for people who haven't undergone a needle biopsy and the MRI? If you could just sort of take us through
Sure.
that experience.
I mean, the needle biopsy is really quick and quite painless. What they do is depending on how resilient you are to pain or not, they can either do it just by putting a very small fine needle into the lump and withdrawing some of the sort of fluid and matter in it, or in my case, because I'm a little bit squeamish, they gave me a small local anaesthetic and did it under a local. And it was painless, and it was over and done in about sort of 5 minutes or so, actually being in there to do it. The MRI, I've only had one of those. To be honest, I don't ever want another one again, if I'm perfectly honest. It's quite a noisy process. fMRI scanners are really quite noisy, and they're quite confining as well. well. And it was when they gave me that when they were still trying to work out whether it was a lymphoma or a head and neck cancer or whatever. So that's why they sort of did my sort of head in the MRI scanner. And the biggest problem for me was keeping still for the sort of 20-25 minutes that they took to do it. I still remember being sort of encouraged from the control room to sort of keep still and not breathe too much and make sure that the image was actually quite sharp. I deliberately forget about the MRI bit because I really didn't like it very much, which actually when you sort of think about treatment in general, if that was the worst bit of the treatment, that's actually not too bad.
Right, not too bad. So as you said, yeah, it's kind of a good indication if that's one of the worst things that kind of sort of happened at that point. But it is, for people who are claustrophobic, not the best experience.
No, it's not.
Do you remember how long it took to get results from both the fine needle biopsy and the MRI?
It was pretty quick. I mean, it was certainly within a couple of weeks for the needle biopsy, and it was probably a couple of weeks or so after the MRI that I actually got the MRI and the excision biopsy. They were done at about the same sort of time to actually get the full diagnosis. So, you know, I think the cancer services in the UK have a target of sort of 56 days or something like that from referral from the GP to actually diagnosis or first treatment. Obviously being diagnosis and watch and wait in my case, and it was certainly done well within that sort of time frame.
Good. Thank you for taking us through that. And then before we move further, there was also the excision biopsy. Could you describe that experience for us?
That was interesting. I was probably more frightened of that than most things, but actually it was pretty much of a non-event. So that was done as a day surgery again at the local hospital. So went in, I don't know, it must have been 7 or 8 in the morning. They gave me sort of pre-meds, made sure that I was comfortable, and the next thing I remember is sort of waking up in the recovery room a couple of hours later. So I think the process literally took them minutes to do, and a couple of hours to come round from anaesthetic. I just remember feeling incredibly hungry after it, and them feeding me sandwiches, and yeah. But I was home that afternoon, and probably had a day or so off work to recover from that. A bit of a dressing, but it was fine. In fact, I think about a week, 10 days after I'd had it done, we went over to Africa on safari for a couple of weeks to celebrate our 50th birthday. So it couldn't have been that bad.
Wow, yeah, you just get to go on the best trips. That's what I'm.
It was our 50th birthday year, so it was we had a lot planned for that year.
Yeah, live life like Tim. I
Absolutely.
So at this point, you and your wife have heard 2 diagnoses, one more specific, but it's you have cancer, and then it's the more specific diagnosis. Can you bring us back to the time when the doctor's telling you that first time and mentioning cancer? I mean, that's never. Yeah.
It was a bit surreal, actually, if I remember it properly, because the way that it worked was that the first conversation I had with him was when he was giving me the news about the specific type of lymphoma that it was. And he was there with the nurse specialist as well. So again, I'm not sure what it's like in the US, but in the UK, if you get a cancer diagnosis, you get a nurse specialist assigned to you, as well as someone who can sort of integrate the various bits of the health system for you and to look after you. And Alan, who's my nurse specialist, has been with me actually all the way along the journey, along with the other specialists in Derby as well. And it was a sort of conversation with them, and I sort of sat there and sort of nodded along, like, yeah, and you'll be able to treat it, won't you? Okay, that's fine. And I sort of went off into a sort of side room with the nurse specialist, and he sort of, gave me some various literature to read from what's now Lymphoma Action. It was the Lymphoma Association. Some helpful guides about sort of what to expect and what have you. And I was still sat there going, oh yeah, but it's going to be all right. I'm going to be able to work through this and all the rest of it. He said, well, maybe not with this one, because the treatment's sort of fairly tough, and not a lot of people tend to work full time through it. And it was there was still some degree of denial at that point. And also at the time when I had that first meeting, they hadn't worked out whether it was one that they needed to treat immediately or not. So I went fairly quickly after that meeting for some more sort of tests and procedures for them to actually figure out whether they needed to act straight away, which was actually the presumption when I spoke to the consultant originally, or whether it was something that was suitable for watch and wait. I think the numbers have changed over the years, but at the time when I was going through diagnosis, I think something like about 10 or 15% of patients were considered suitable for watch and wait. Now it's closer to 30 or 40% with mantle cell lymphoma that go through that, because the diagnostics have got better and the understanding of the disease has got better as well. And actually the treatments have got better even in the last sort of 5 or 6 years that I've been living with this thing as well. So there was this sort of presumption that I'd be treated straight away. And actually when I'd been for what was a bone marrow biopsy, and actually I think that was it. I think it was just a bone marrow biopsy and some further blood tests. That was when they said, well, hang on a minute, we can probably afford to wait with this one before we actually start you on treatment.
Actually, since you brought it up, I know you had to undergo the bone marrow biopsy as well as PET CT scan, all the fun stuff that comes with the diagnosis. Could you describe those two in particular?
I can, yeah. So there were 3 things actually that I went for after or 4 things if you count the blood test, but there were 3 things that I'd not had before after the original diagnosis. So one of them was for a bone marrow biopsy, and what they do with that is they give you, again, a sort of local anaesthetic in the small of your back, and it's sort of like, don't make this sound too gruesome, but it's like a drill or something. What they're trying to do is they're trying to get into one of the bone, hopefully where there aren't too many nerve endings, to take a sample out of there. And one of the things with lymphoma is that it obviously impacts, as well as the blood, it impacts the bone marrow as well, which is where the blood cells are made. So they're doing that to try and understand whether or not the lymphoma is present in the bone marrow, and if it is, how much the bone marrow is actually affected. So it's part of the staging process for it. The other thing that I went for was a PET CT scan. So that's different from an MRI, and the machines are much more open, and it's like lying on a giant photocopier is probably the best way to describe it. But you've got a big donut around you as well, and you sort of passed backwards and forwards through the machine. I actually quite like PET CT scans. They're quite good fun. But what they were using that for was that obviously there was a lymph node or 2 in my neck that had obviously started to swell. What they were checking was to see whether there was anything else in my chest or in my sort of groin, legs, those sorts of areas where the other lymph nodes are. And so they sort of put you through this process, and that helps them stage it. And what they found with those 2 tests was that there was nothing visible in the bone marrow at all. And that as far as lymph nodes were concerned, the only ones that were swollen at that time were the couple that were in my neck, and there was a suspicion of a couple in the groin as well. But that was it. There was nothing in my chest cavity. There was nothing else. So that got me staged as stage 3. Which again is quite unusual in itself. A lot of mantle cell lymphoma patients, because lymphoma is systemic, everybody tends to get staged at stage 4. But I was stage 3. actually for MCL patients, it really doesn't make a lot of difference to the outcome. The treatments are good regardless of where you're staged, which is, encouraging. If you if people hear sort of stage 4 cancer, they tend to get very, very freaked out, but that's not necessary really with MCL, because the outcomes are actually much more dependent upon age than staging, and
Right.
the speed of progression of the disease as well.
Right. Other factors. I'm glad you pointed that out, because in say solid tumors, the staging of 4 means something quite different than
Yes, it does. It does, and
lymphomas.
it's rather different in
Right.
lymphomas.
Right. And do you remember about how long? So was it another couple of weeks as well to get those results?
Yeah, it probably was about another couple of weeks after going through the PET CT scan, the bone marrow biopsy, and the other thing that gave me was a thing called a Mugger test, which was to basically check heart function to make sure that if I was going to have chemotherapy, then that I would be able to stand up to that. And I came through with flying colours on that one, so that was all right.
Always
Yeah,
love to get any bit of good news after these things, right?
absolutely.
Well, and so to your point, bone marrow biopsy, the PET CT scan, they were done to really figure out staging after you got the
Yeah,
MCL diagnosis.
yeah,
And then it was, okay, you're stage 3, let's watch and wait, which
yeah.
ended up doing from September of 2014 to January of 2018.
That's right.
Big chunk of time. I'm going to
Yeah, 3.5 years.
Yes. And I know during that time you said you had appointments with your consultant every
Yeah,
3 months and
yep,
about annual PET CT scans, and
yes.
that's kind of a lot to deal with, in the wait and watch sort of regimen. I'm going to bring up a photo you sent me from January
Yeah,
of 2017,
yeah.
and we can talk about that. And then if you could just describe, because people may hear this and think, I can't wait that long. Like, I want to get something done. If you could
Okay,
sort of describe how you got through the wait and watch.
sure.
Yeah. There we go.
Okay. Yeah. That's you have to remind me of the date. I think that's January,
Actually, I'm sorry, it's September of 2017.
September 2017. So this is about 4 or 5 months before I started treatment, and I don't know why I did it. I was playing with my phone, and I managed to take a photograph of myself when I was on a flight back from, I think it was Germany, for work. And what you can see over again on the sort of left hand side of my neck is the sort of the extent of the lump, and you can see that it's grown rather more there from where it had been sort of 18 months previously. And if you look over on the right hand side of the neck, there's nothing really very apparent there at that particular point in time. What happened in between when that photo was taken in September of 2017 and when I saw my consultant in January of 2018, the right hand side of my neck, which had shown virtually nothing, basically woke up and overtook the left hand side of my neck in size and an extent of the swelling on the lymph nodes. And actually, by the time that I went and saw my consultant in say January, maybe early February 2018, I looked a little bit like Frankenstein's monster, I think, at that particular point. But yeah, no, even when it was that big, it wasn't causing me any problems with breathing. It wasn't painful. I just looked frightful. So it was so that was what was there. And actually, it was the size of that swelling coupled with what I'd then got over on the right hand side of my neck as well, that basically encouraged my consultant to sort of say, well, actually, it probably is about time now for us to start treatment, because it does look quite bulky.
Right.
And given that, the other side of my neck had basically ballooned in the space of 3 months, what it had taken, the left hand side of my neck sort of 3.5 years to get to, it was sort of like, yeah, it's probably time that we treat it. So yeah, that was how that conversation happened. But the 3.5 years on watch and wait, when you're originally told that, it's a bit difficult to get your head around, because the general sort of sort of view in the press, and if you talk to people, is that it's cancer, and the best way to deal with cancer is that you treat it immediately, and bang, that's the way that you do it. Actually, with something like mantle cell lymphoma, that's not really the case. If you look at the research that's been done around it and the various treatments that are there, what it shows is that actually, if you can afford to be on watch and wait, if it's slow growing, if it's indolent like mine was, then actually your outcome is better to wait than to start treatment straight away, because the amount of the sort of average time of remission that you get from this after treatment is about the same regardless of when you actually start. It's why the staging doesn't make so much difference in this particular case. So once I'd actually managed to get my head around that, it was like, well, actually this is rather good, because I'm going to get, hopefully, sort of, a few more months or a few more years potentially of sort of healthy living, a healthy life that I can do things in before I need to worry about treatment and to start treatment. And it also gives you the ability to actually prepare yourself for it as well when it starts. So what initially sort of seemed like are you really sure about this, turned into sort of something that actually was fabulous. And I did some great stuff in those sort of in those 3.5 years, things that I'd been putting off doing that I eventually got around to doing. I think I sent you a couple of photographs of my pride and joy that lives in the garage downstairs, which is a sort of Caterham 7 sports car. Yeah, I'd wanted one of those since I was a teenager, and one of those things that I've been putting off, and eventually getting the diagnosis convinced me to go and buy it. I've had a lot of fun in it in the last 4 or 5 years.
I love the message there, which is, it's not just like, oh gosh, I gotta wait and see what happens. This is a drag. It's great. I get to live my life and do things I really want to do, and it's a great reminder not to wait to do those things. Let me pull up that. Well, you know what? I'll do it at the end, because I think it's
okay, fair enough.
end with that. You remind me at the end, Tim, to bring that.
All right, I will do.
Okay, I'm gonna now. So basically, there's this 3.5-year period.
Yeah.
Finally, in January 2018, you go to your regular appointment. To sum up again, they give you a bone marrow biopsy. Results are still clear. The PET CT scan, however, of which you got the results apparently February 14th of that
That's
year,
right.
led to the decision, let's do active treatment now.
Yeah.
And you were stage to 2 because the lymph nodes in the groin area had actually gone. But which is amazing.
It was bizarre. It really was. I mean, when I was first diagnosed with the PET CT scan back in 2014, 2015, the lymph nodes in the groin were marginal anyway. I think they said they were about sort of 11 millimeters across, something like that, which is only just slightly outside the normal bounds. When they restaged me with that PET CT scan before I started treatment, then it showed everything that we were expecting around the sort of neck and shoulders, and that was really quite bulky disease at that point. But what was in the groin had gone. So actually, if you looked at the doctor's report, it said, "Oh, he's stage 2." It's like, "Oh, I've gone back a stage then." But as I say, it wasn't the main thing that decided treatment. It was the bulkiness of what I'd actually got in my neck. I think the largest lymph node at that point was about 5.5 centimeters across, about 3 inches, something of that nature. So pretty bulky, and there were a lot of them as well that that had lit up.
This is so interesting. So many twists and turns in Tim's story. But again, to your point, I mean, it's always nice to see a lower number, but to your point, it's the staging, not so much what dictates the treatment and the outcome. So let's talk about how your doctor described to you what your treatment regimen would be.
Sure. So, I mean, actually, that was one of the very first discussions that we had at diagnosis, and the standard of care in the UK for someone of my age, which is relatively young, for mantle cell lymphoma at 50 is to go through what's called the Nordic protocol chemotherapy, followed by a stem cell transplant from your own cells. They harvest your cells as part of the process. So what Nordic chemotherapy consists of is two different types of drugs, or two different combinations of drugs that are given over 6 cycles of treatment, 3 or 4 weeks apart. So one of the, and you'll have to forget because I can't remember the drug names, but the first, the odd cycles were what they called CHOP or maxi CHOP. So 4 different drugs, and that was given as an outpatient. So I was just there basically for the day, having that as basically a set of infusions. There was a steroid tablet that I had to take, prednisolone. The others were sort of given as, you know, bolus injections, sort of injections into the arm. So they were fairly sort of quick. You were just in for the day. The even numbered cycles were where they gave me a thing called cytarabine, or high dose cytarabine. And the way that they give that is they give it as 3 8-hour infusions. Now, obviously, if it's going to take 8 hours for you to have one of those infusions, then you're going to be there for a while. So what they do is they keep you as an inpatient in over for 2 or 3 days, so they can actually give it to you. The other drug that has been constant through there has also been my maintenance drug as well, post-transplant, is a thing called Rituximab, which is a monoclonal antibody, I think is the terminology, but that's part of the cocktail. They don't give you that in the first cycle, because if the disease is bulky, then Rituximab can have quite an interesting impact on it, in that it can be too effective, and people potentially struggle with it. So they leave that till the second cycle to start giving you, and then they give it you really, really slowly, and then it's only over time, as they figure out your tolerance for that drug, that they actually speed that part of the treatment up. So now, when I'm going in for my Rituximab maintenance every couple of months, literally it takes about 10 minutes or so to give me that drug subcutaneously as an injection. The very first time I had it, I think the infusion that they gave me was probably about 4 or 5 hours. It might not have been that long, but it was a long time compared to what it is now. So they treat that one with a fair amount of care.
Yeah.
Talking to other people that have been through this as well, I seem to be in a minority in that I coped better with the cytarabine part of the chemotherapy than the maxi CHOP stuff. The maxi CHOP stuff, after the third cycle, I don't know, I lost most of April, I think, after trying to recover from that. So yeah, I wasn't keen on the on the CHOP part of it. The cytarabine was far easier, but as I say, other people that I know that I've spoken to have said, oh no, the CHOP chemotherapy was really easy. The cytarabine that I couldn't stand.
And that's a great point to bring up, which is, look, we all have individual responses to
we do.
drugs and chemicals and whatnot. So just to clarify, it was 6 cycles, alternating
6 cycles
between the two.
Correct.
The 1, 3, and 5 were the CHOP.
Yep.
And you did get the Rituximab. Did you get the Rituximab for
the Rituximab went from cycle 2 onwards, and then in effect the 6th dose of Rituximab they give you as a standalone treatment after the 6th cycle is finished. So you basically get 6 lots of everything, but that's the way that they deal with that one.
Interesting. Okay, because our CHOP, which is similar. I mean, it's the same regimen is used in other lymphoma. So you were basically getting that for your cycles 1, 3, 5, except for the first cycle, but it was made up at the end, and then cycle 4 and 6 was the one you hate. You didn't as much. Actually.
That's fine.
And that was done inpatient. Okay.
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Before we move forward, so you got this all done IV, like you didn't get a port or a PICC line?
Right. So I mean that's interesting in itself. So the way that they prefer to, and it is different at different hospitals across the UK. Other people's experiences have been different, but they reckon that I got reasonably good veins. So um, there's a trade-off between having something like a PICC line or a Hickman line versus a cannula just when you're having the drugs. Because clearly, if you've got a PICC line in there permanently or semi-permanently, there's always the chance of infection getting in as well. So the way that Derby preferred to give it was, if they could, they would give it you through a cannula. And actually, I went through that and had a sort of cannula put in for the first. Actually, it was the first 5 cycles of chemotherapy, and I'd on the 5th cycle, I'd gone through having the cannula put in, and they'd managed to give me the Rituximab and the first 2 bags of Cytarabine. But then, because I'd sort of slept overnight, the cannula had moved, and they found it then impossible to put another cannula into me. So the way that they finished the 5th cycle was to basically put a PICC line in me, which was all right. I had the PICC line for basically the 5th and 6th, or the end of the 5th and the 6th cycle. Actually, it was quite nice having it, because it was easier then for them to take blood and all the rest of it. So that was in. That PICC line, though, had to come out before I had my stem cell harvest, because what they give you, certainly at Nottingham, where I had it done, which is some next door city to Derby, it's a bigger city. They can't do the stem cell transplants in Derby. They're not set up to do it, but they are in Nottingham, which is sort of 20 miles or so away. They put in a Hickman line into the chest, and that has 2 lumens in it, so it has 2 filaments in it rather than just the one that they would give chemotherapy through, because they need the 2 lumens to basically move it through the harvesting machine. And they left that in for the stem cell transplant as well, where they give you other chemotherapy as well. So that was the story with sort of the lines and cannulas and things like that. I don't like needles, but I don't mind them putting a cannula in. It's usually fairly painless. And
you got a little bit of everything, you got
absolutely, yeah. Whatever works, I think, is the honest answer.
And so I do want to go into the side effects too that you experience from both the CHOP and the Cytarabine. I can't pronounce it at all. I will.
Cytarabine, yeah.
Yeah, I will pull up a photo of the hair loss that you sent over. But yeah, could you describe the side effects from both of the different chemo regimens, and and how long it took to hit you, and also if you could share some tips for people about what helped.
I think on the whole, I probably got off lightly. So the one thing that they guarantee as a side effect of this treatment is hair loss, and my hair started to come out between the sort of first and second cycles. So it was starting to thin just before. That was just before I went into the went in and had my first lot of Cytarabine. So my hair's not actually got much thicker than that today. It was a lot thicker sort of 5 or 6 years ago. But you can see it's just sort of starting to go there. And I did lose all of my hair, including those, including my eyebrows, which is still quite prominent today. So lost everything really by about the time that the second cycle had started. So about 3-4 weeks in, something like that. And after I'd had the sort of 6 cycles of the Nordic chemo, there was a sort of couple-month gap before I started the stem cell transplant piece. So my hair had actually started to grow back by the time that I went in for my stem cell transplant. And of course, the chemotherapy drugs that they give you then again removed the hair again. So I lost it twice in sort of fairly quick succession. It didn't really bother me, to be honest. The only thing that did bother me was that I know sort of a lot of men sort of have lose their hair, and I don't know quite how they manage it, because my head was just permanently cold, so I was forever wearing sort of a woolly hat, even in, you know, sort of what was sort of well, for us, sort of summer, sort of early autumn, I guess. It just felt very cold and drafty most of the time, but actually quite, I didn't actually mind how I looked, if I was perfectly honest. It was it's like, yeah, that's me in my hat, or me in one of my hats.
Let me pull it back up while you continue talking about your side effects.
Yeah, the other side effects. Um, food tastes differently. You know, people talk about a metallic. Yeah, that's a terrible photograph, but that's great. That and the eyebrows are much thinner there as well. But the taste of food. You know, I sort of got some metallic tastes. I was still able to eat. I still kept eating all the way through, but what I could taste and how I could taste it was different. So I found things like you know, strongly tasting foods and strongly tasting drinks were far better for me. I went off things like coffee and tea, which I drink gallons of normally, and instead went for you don't have it over in the US, things like Iron Brew, which is a sort of Scottish sugary drink. That was quite nice. Diet Coke, that sort of stuff as well. But yeah, and anything that was sort of more sort of strongly tasting was better. I didn't lose a huge amount of weight through the process either. I think I started off, and you have to view me because I'm talking kilograms rather than pounds, but I was about sort of 93, 94 kilos when I started treatment. At my lowest, I dropped to about 80 kilos, so I only lost about 14 kilos, which is probably, I don't know, 28, 35 pounds, something like that. You know, it's all come back on again since. I'm sort of back up to the weight that I was before I started treatment. So, you know, bit of weight loss. Fatigue, certainly. You know, I felt pretty washed out after each of the treatment cycles. Usually it sort of kicked in a couple of days afterwards, and then would sort of persist for you know, maybe a week or two. The sort of 3-week gap between the cycles, it felt like, you know, the first week after treatment was, you know, sort of going down the dip and not feeling terribly good. The second week, sort of things started to stabilize, and then by the time that you got to the end of the cycle at the third week, then I felt pretty good again. And, you know, you were sort of going on that roller coaster all the way through the process. But yeah, no, I was fortunate. I didn't suffer from any sort of infections or anything like that through the process. So I got away with it fairly lightly, I think, on the whole. But you know, we took pretty good precautions at home, so sort of lots of hand washing and making sure that, you know, people weren't in the house with me, and all that kind of stuff. Actually, it's pretty much like living now, to
Right,
be
I was
honest.
about to
So
say,
yeah, we got a preview of it a couple of years ago.
right, you're probably the best at COVID, you know, because you're the best practice of anyone.
Yeah, it's not got me yet.
Well, you know, I'm so glad that, you know, it seemed, all things considered, you didn't
Yeah,
experience like too adverse of effects. I mean, they weren't pleasant,
no.
but um,
Uh, it was interesting. You're right. It wasn't particularly pleasant. It's not something that I'd want to go through again, I don't think. But you know, looking back on it, yeah, and again, just talking with other people who've been through similar treatments, I think I got away reasonably lightly, certainly through that sort of first stage of basically using the chemo. The other thing that was very, very noticeable, I talked about the big lumps that I had on the side of my neck. They had started to shrink pretty quickly after the first cycle, and they weren't visible by about the end of the third cycle. And then a PET CT scan I had, I think between cycles 5 and 6, showed no evidence of the disease at that point. So yeah, it was pretty effective. It was pretty effective stuff, that's for sure.
I mean, yeah, I read that and I was like, I mean, that's the best news you can get is even
Yeah,
before
it
the
is.
treatment's over. It's like, hey, we don't see it anymore. So,
Yay.
yay, which is, what we strive for in
Yeah.
this position. I guess since you brought it up, when they relayed that news, and I know you still had to finish the sixth
Mhm.
cycle and have the transplant.
Yeah.
What was that like for you and your wife hearing that, look, there's no evidence of disease?
It was a great sense of relief. I mean, again, I sort of went into it knowing that that treatment was actually pretty successful at putting people into remission. I think the stats show something like about 96, 97% successful at actually achieving either a complete remission or a good partial remission. So we knew that it was hopefully going to be effective. Um, I'd sort of read stories as well of sort of people sort of, their lumps magically disappearing after about one cycle and them feeling really great. And of course mine didn't. Mine took a little bit longer to go down. So actually I was probably more worried through sort of cycle 2, cycle 3. I'm going, are they really going? Are they really shrinking? To which, yeah, James was saying, yeah, they are. Yeah, I'm trying to think. Yeah, that's between the third and so that must be cycle 4. That's me as an inpatient in Derby. You can see that I've lost most of my hair at that point, and the eyebrows are pretty thin as well. But yeah, you can't actually see the lumps on the sides of the on the sides of the neck. I'd forgotten I'd sent you that photograph. Actually, it's a terrible photo.
Well, I was just about to disagree because, first of all, the color in your face is great, and you've got your eyebrows. I lost
Yeah.
all my eyebrows. They certainly didn't look like that. I mean, I was bald, completely bald.
Yeah, yeah, but you've got great big caterpillars here. It's
Very good. Okay, and so how about with your family? In terms of the reaction in getting that
yeah.
news.
Um, I, 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 I don't know. I think they reacted pretty well, really. I mean, I got an awful lot of support from them, from my wife, and also from my 2 daughters as well, and that was good. And actually, in some ways, because my wife has also recently had cancer treatment as well for a different cancer. But
Um,
I found it much easier to be a patient than I have been to be a carer, if I'm perfectly honest. So. They were there for me. The support was great from them, and particularly also from friends and from work colleagues as well. I mean, I was fortunate in that I had that sort of support network, really. And having sat both sides of it now, I much prefer being a patient to being
and
a carer. It's much easier to cope with your own stuff than it is to cope with other
somebody
people's.
else's.
Yeah,
Actually, and Tim, I do want to, in our last part of this interview, talk about that more because I think
sure.
it's a really important topic. But so you got this great news, you finish out your last cycle, and then
Mhm.
yeah, describe sort of what happens between then and then the actual transplant.
Sure. So I finished cycle 6, and I was basically booked in about, I must have been a week or so after that sort of 6th cycle had finished, into Nottingham to go and have the stem cell harvesting. And what they do, yeah, there's a picture there. The picture over on the left is is sort of my view of the machine that they use to sort of harvest the stem cells in. So what they do is they basically take your Hickman line and filter the blood through this machine, and there's a sort of big centrifuge sat in there, and the sort of pink liquid in the back of the photograph on the left, those are the stem cells that they've harvested. The liquid to the left, the sort of yellowy brown color, that's plasma. They also take that from you as well, and they mix the plasma with the stem cells together before they give it back to you as part of the transplant. Now, that whole process of being on the machine took about 6 hours or so for them to harvest enough cells to be done, and they did that on the Friday of one week. Now, the way that they organize it is they basically say that it could actually take up to a week to get the stem cells from you. So when I showed up to Nottingham Hospital on the Monday morning, they took my bloods and took one look at me and said, there's no way we're putting you on that machine, because basically you don't have any white blood cells, you're anemic, and your platelets are too low as well. So actually the first 2 days that I went backwards and forwards to Nottingham for them to harvest, they basically gave me blood and platelet transfusions instead to make me better, because the one thing that the chemo does is it really knocks your blood counts down. So they did that, and by the second day I was sort of, not doing too badly. But the other thing that they're looking for before they harvest the stem cells is that there are sufficient of them there to harvest. So there's a blood marker that says whether it is, and they give you injections, so a thing called lenagrastim, which actually stimulates the production of stem cells. Now I've been taking those since the end of the 6th cycle, or injecting myself, nightly with lenagrastim since the end of the cycle, and obviously through the week that I was in Nottingham and trying to harvest the cells as well. And those counts only gradually came up, and they only came up fairly slowly. I don't know what the units are, but it needed to be over 10 before they would hook you up to the machine. And by Thursday, I think I'd hit 9.6, which was still too low for them to put me on the machine. So at that point, they called out what they call the big guns, which is an injection called plerixafor. And they gave me that on the Thursday, and when I went back in on the Friday, that marker was up at about 23 or something like that. So that was when they put me on the machine and grabbed the stem cells quick before they went. That seemed to be that seems to be quite a typical process. Very few people actually turn up for stem cell harvest and tick all the boxes so they can do them on the first day. And I was probably a little bit slower than usual, but they got them, and they got the right quality of them, the right quantity as well. I think they're aiming for a couple of million of these things per liter of blood, and they got about 2.8 million or something like that. So yeah, but it took a week. It's like Groundhog Day. You were going to the hospital every single day, and they take the blood test. No, you're not okay. It was. Yeah, it's Groundhog Day is one of my favourite movies. It's one of the things that I watched in my sort of 3 weeks whilst I was having the stem cell transplant.
That's right. It is a great movie, and
it is.
And great, reminder for people. Look, when you go in for these procedures, again, it's very individual. So you may have it happen quicker, you may not, and just sort of buckle in for what could be a longer ride.
And they do get there in the end.
Yes, it will happen. It will happen. They know what they're doing. So I know that it took, actually, I want to clarify. Do you remember if it was July that it happened or August?
I'm trying to think now, actually. I think it was July that I actually went for the harvest. Okay. Yes, it would have been July.
Because actually, from your dates. I realized in the pictures it said August. I just wanted to clarify that.
I think originally I'd been booked in for the stem cell transplant, the process, actually only about sort of week, 10 days after the harvest. And I spoke with a consultant at Nottingham, and he said, well, look, we can push that back a month. And actually, at that point, that was what I wanted to hear, because I really didn't want to just sort of carry straight through. And actually having August, which was actually quite a nice month, we managed to get away for a week on holiday, not too far from home, but in a beautiful part of the country. And it was just nice to just sort of recharge and not be a patient for for a month or so.
Like a bag to get poked and prodded and all that stuff. We need to do another video interview where you just take us through your journeys around the world or around the country. You're living life the right way, I think. So you get the break in August, you get to be for a little bit again, and then it says September 5th is when your process started, which doesn't mean right away.
No.
You had the beam induction chemotherapy for 7 days. So
that's right.
Can you bring us through what that was like?
Okay, so that was basically 7 days running of different chemotherapy drugs. So Beam, that's the sort of first letters of each of the different drugs. So it's bendamustine, um, etoposide. I can't remember what the A is, and M is something like methylane or something like that. The really nasty one is the last one, which is the M, which they give you the day before you have the transplant. But the point of that whole process is they call it conditioning chemotherapy. What they're doing is they're basically trying to kill off any last trace of the lymphoma. And so they do that by throwing basically 7 days of chemotherapy at you straight. And the aim is to basically remove all of that. And as a consequence of that, what happens a few days after you've finished all of those bags of chemotherapy drugs is your white blood count drops to 0. So you're incredibly vulnerable to infection at that particular point in the process. The way again that they do it here in the UK, which again is slightly different to some of the centres in the States, is that it's done completely as an inpatient process. So you're given a room, a sort of isolation room for the 3 weeks or so that the transplant process particularly takes, and they obviously don't want you to wander outside too much or have too many visitors and things like that. They try and keep everything as clean as possible. The 3 weeks that I was in the sort of air purifying system, it was a bit like living on a plane for 3 weeks. It was that sort of noise, and the best investment that I made was to buy a set of noise cancelling headphones to wear and to sleep in. And I think without those, I'd have probably gone madder than I am now. But it was a really good way of actually getting through it and getting through that and getting through the noise of the air filtration systems. I'd probably make it sound worse than it was, but it was just a constant background noise. But you know, if you're on an airplane, it's that sort of whiny, drony noise, and yeah, no, not fun.
Not fun, and it sounds minor, but look, I think it's about making it as
Yeah,
palatable as possible to get through. And so I'm glad
yeah,
you're bringing up that suggestion. If you can
yeah,
get noise canceling
yeah.
headphones. By the way, Beam, I love these chemotherapy names, these drug names. That's the letter because
I could have probably reeled off what the drugs were at one
yeah,
point. And again, it's just one of those things you put to the back, but it's standard for this type of
of
transplant
conditioning.
where they do it. So after they've wiped out everything, that's when they give you your stem cells back, and that's actually a bit of an anticlimax.
Right.
It took about 30 minutes or so, I think, in total. And at that point, they sort of say, right, okay, so actually, it's going to get really bad in about 3 or 4 days' time when the counts drop to 0. And I was actually feeling, pretty good at that point. If I was honest, I was still eating okay, I was still drinking okay, I felt okay in myself. I think there's a photo somewhere that I sent you of actually the transplant happening, and it's nothing much. Really. I mean, it's a miracle of modern science, but
Yeah,
it's like they finish just think, well, okay, all right, so that wasn't so bad. And
good.
sure enough, everything sort of hit about 3 or 4 days after the transplant, because that's when my
Right,
counts dropped really
right,
low. I
right.
felt pretty unwell, had some fairly nasty side effects from the chemo drug because it sort of affected my sort of windpipe downwards. So
Yeah,
that was pretty painful, pretty sore. And I also developed an infection. So, middle of the night, it was a case of them sort of giving me a chest X-ray, which I think took about 3 goes to get right, because I got very long lungs apparently and didn't fit on the X-ray plate, and sort of intravenous antibiotics. But actually, if I look back at the diary that I kept, day 3, day 4 after the transplant felt pretty horrible. Actually, I mean, they were really not pleasant days to live through. By day 5 and 6, I'd started to perk up a bit, and I was discharged on day 11 after the transplant. So I was in for about 20 days in total, which is pretty fast going. They reckon on average about 3 weeks, about 21, 22
Right.
days. Some people are in 4 or 5 weeks. Not many people sort of escape much under sort of
Earlier
19 or
than that.
20 days.
It's
So
a long
yeah.
hospital stay. And so do you have guidance other than the noise cancellation headphones? Anything else in terms of helping other people cope through
Yeah.
such a long
Uh,
stay in the hospital?
take things that make you feel comfortable. So I took things like blankets and dressing gowns from home to that weren't sort of too hospitally. Books, DVDs, box sets. I got through. Again, this isn't going to mean an awful lot to anyone that's listening from the US, but there's a detective series that the BBC put out in the late 70s, early 80s called Shoestring, which only ran for 2 seasons, about 20, 21 episodes in total. But I consumed all of those. I rewatched the whole of The Prisoner, so Patrick McGoogan from the 60s, again another sort of typically British TV show, I guess, and lots of other things as well. Just stuff to keep yourself entertained. Again, Nottingham, you got a television and a DVD player and things like that, and because you're in a room by yourself, I could entertain myself,
Right.
and I slept a lot as well, and did my exercises like the physio wanted me to do, all of those sorts of things, just to get some sort of routine into the day, and moving around, making sure that I was still mobile. They give you a lot of good advice before you go in, and a lot of it is about following that advice.
Right.
But also, it's like, well, I'm going to be locked in here for 3 weeks. I'm going to take things that I want to be there. Things that remind me of home, remind the
Right.
kids. A couple of soft, cuddly toys that I took with me, Eeyores. Yeah, just anything that makes it feel a little bit less like a hospital room
Yes.
and more like a hotel room, I guess.
Yes. Yes. Absolutely. Not like home, but like a hotel room,
No,
which I
yeah,
appreciate. So before we and thank you for all your time. I do want to get to some of the last questions.
sure.
But I know with the follow up, I mean, so after the transplant, it was recovery at home, and then did they say, okay, now you have to come in every so often? What was that? What was that discussion?
Yeah. So they keep pretty good tracks on you for the first sort of 2 or 3 weeks after the transplant. So I was about a week later, I was back to Nottingham for them to remove my Hickman line that I'd had put in for the transplant. So they gave me a good check then. I was also still in contact with the team that I'd had at Derby as well. I think I went and saw them round about 2 or 3 weeks after I'd had the transplant. I'd got a district nurse coming around to see me at home about once a week when I got the line in, before they took that out, to make sure that it was clean and stuff like that. So they keep pretty good tabs on you. They also give you sort of an emergency card, to sort of say, well, look, if you feel even on the slightest unwell, if you think you've got a temperature or whatever, then you phone this number, and the number gets you straight through to the specialists at Derby, the wards at Derby that treat lymphoma patients. And if they're in the slightest bit worried, they will take you in and have you in overnight and look after you. I only had to use that once, and that was, I can't remember when that was. It was some time after transplant. I went through my counts dropped a bit, and I think I'd eaten something out somewhere that had made me feel unwell, so they kept me in for a night. But the support systems are there, and it's about using them and making sure that that you're comfortable in doing that.
Okay.
So yeah, pretty close tabs. But over time, it becomes less so. Now, when I was originally diagnosed with mantle cell lymphoma, the process was do the 6 cycles of Nordic chemo, do the stem cell transplant, you're done. And what had happened in between time was the research showed that there was actually benefit in, after having the stem cell transplant, to have maintenance Rituximab every couple of months for 3 years, which is the process that I'm actually going through at the moment. So Yeah. So every couple of months or so, I get a Rituximab injection. As I say, literally takes about 10 minutes to administer, and that helps to sort of keep on top of it. Photos you've got there. The one on the left is me at my first day back at work. So I started chemo on the 1st of March 2018, and I went back to work, I think it was about the 2nd or 3rd week of January of 2019. So I was actually off work for just under 11 months in total. And my employers were terrific about it. Actually, they and the insurance scheme have meant that there hasn't really been any sort of financial worry associated with it. And I recognise that I'm fortunate in that, in terms of the employer scheme that I've got and all the rest of it. So yeah, that's me sat in my office in Derby. The one over on the right is me sat in my Caterham 7 that I mentioned earlier on. There we go. Yeah, that's it for those of you that don't know what one looks like. It's they were originally built by Lotus, so they've been manufactured in one form or another for about the last 60 odd years. It's a terrific little thing to drive. It's completely unrefined. There's no airbags, no power steering. There's no entertainment center or anything like that. It is. It is what it is, and it's just great fun. And
Yes, fun, beautiful.
perhaps not in the weather that we're having at the moment over here, but it is good fun in the summer.
That's right. And, I have to ask, to segue from what you're talking about, it sounds like, Tim, we've, just met, but that you love life and you try to live life to the fullest. And I would just wonder, has cancer and the diagnosis impacted you in one way or the other?
I think that's a really difficult question to answer. I think it's impacted possibly what I will put up with and what I won't put up with. So, the sort of job that I do means that I'm customer and client facing a lot of the time, and I work with our salespeople as well. And salespeople can be a breed apart at times, and I guess I'm less prepared to put up with some of the nonsense today than I was maybe sort of 5 or 6 years ago before I went through the whole thing. But yeah, probably not. I've always had a fairly sort of similar sort of outlook on life, I guess. I'm probably more conscious about trying to, squeeze as much out of my time as possible as well. So, and not putting off things that I wanted to do. So that car is a really good example of that. It's something. Again, it goes back to the TV series The Prisoner. If you watched the opening titles for that, the opening titles are they show the star actually driving one of those cars. And so that was where I sort of first fell in love with these things, when I was sort of a kid in the 70s, sort of watching the repeats of a 1960s TV show. And it was like, oh yeah, it'd be really cool to have one of those. And so life and family and kids and everything else sort of gets in the way. And actually, when I was diagnosed, it's like, right, what am I going to do? What do I want to do? And that was one of the things that was on the list, which was actually getting hold of one of those cars and buying it and driving it. It's just great.
And seeing it, I'd never heard of it, but I was like, okay, I get why he's so excited by that beautiful piece of machinery.
Yeah.
On that note, actually, with mantle cell lymphoma, I know you're going through maintenance and it's an ongoing thing. How do you feel about when you're looking forward to your future? Do you ever have anxiety about, getting it again or getting something? I'm just curious about the mental side of it.
I must admit, I try not to think too much about it. The prognosis with mantle cell lymphoma and the treatment that I've gone through, the stem cell transplant, is people inevitably or invariably relapse at some point. And the point of basically doing that watch and wait period, having the most rigorous sort of chemotherapy regime that I could tolerate, based on sort of age, and then going through the maintenance treatment is to actually prolong that remission. Now, if you look at, again, mantle cell lymphoma is one of these things that is a relatively recent diagnosis. I think it was first diagnosed as a separate type of lymphoma in about 1990, 1991, something like that. And if you look back at, don't Google is one of the things that I would say to people, really don't. But if you look back at the sort of the average sort of survival type of people with MCL going back even a decade or maybe a bit more, people are talking about sort of average survival times of about sort of 3 years or so, something like that from diagnosis. Now, clearly I'm 6 years past diagnosis in effect and still going strong. But because doctors actually now understand this disease better and its progression better, and the various different, there are even subtypes within MCL as well, or different ways that it presents. The treatments have got better. So the most recent sort of research suggests that the sort of average sort of remission time for people like myself is maybe somewhere between 7 and 13 years. Now that's a long time, a lot can happen in that sort of time. And some of the newer treatments that are used after relapse are things like the sort of BTK inhibitors like ibrutinib. They are now showing great success in putting people back into remission after sort of initial treatment. And of course, there's the perennial sort of CAR T therapies as well that are starting to be developed now. And I know there have been trials of them over in the US, particularly at places like MD Anderson over in Houston, that have shown great promise. There are clinical trials of CAR T that are actually happening in the UK at the moment as well. So again, that opens up different avenues of treatment for people that do actually relapse. So the way that I'm looking at it now is, rather than it being a life-ending condition or a life-threatening condition, it feels more like a chronic condition that I live with and that I manage with and I cope. And as I say, the only thing that I do get is I do get a little bit of fatigue. So I manage that. I work 4 days a week now rather than 5 days a week, and I also try and make sure that I don't overdo it as well, because if I do overdo it, I do tend to pay for it for a couple of days afterwards. But that's it. I think that's the way that I'll carry on approaching it.
And I've heard that with other tumor types too, with the chronic disease. It's more like that than it is some, yeah, cancer is one of those weird words too, where it means a million different things.
Yeah.
So I'm glad you pointed that out. And actually, I wanted to ask, we have a few minutes left.
Sure.
I'm going to bring up a photo of flowers you received and some socks also, and just the overall topic of for people who are going through this. And by the way, people who read and watch our stories are both patients and caregivers.
Sure.
The topic of support, right?
Yeah.
And so you've been a caregiver as well. So as a patient, though, during MCL, what was the most helpful support, and what would your guidance be to both patients and caregivers of MCL diagnosis?
It was it was just people staying in touch with me, whether it was friends or through work or whatever. So the flowers on the left, they were sent from people at work when I was, I don't know, it was probably when I was going through, I think they arrived at one of the lowest points through the initial bunch of chemo, so around about sort of cycle 3, cycle 4, and that was terrific. I mean, it was completely unexpected, but it was lovely, and I was getting sort of messages of support and things like that, but just people sort of popping up and sort of saying, how was I coping, that sort of thing, just to enable me to talk. The socks, they were great fun as well. They were a birthday present from some very long-standing friends of mine. They're called Happy Socks, and they're great. I've still got them. I still wear them. But again, that was just nice to have in hospital, because they're sort of different from the sort of standard black or grey socks that I'd wear for work, and they made the nurses smile as well. So yeah, it's just, it's just about, for me, the thing that was most helpful was people, you know. I didn't want to be sort of surrounded by people going, oh no, I just wanted people to treat me as normal. One of the most amusing things that happened was, one of my colleagues from work actually came in and saw me on the morning that I was having trouble with the cannula during my fifth cycle, and he'd come just to sort of pop in and say hello and bring me some bars of chocolate and things like that. And he ended up staying with me for most of the day, because, it was like, oh no, we need to put this PICC line in. Can you step outside for a second? So he did, and he waited, and they put it in. They said, oh no, we need to wheel it down to X-ray to make sure that it's in properly. And it wasn't. So they wheeled me back and did it and wheeled me down again. And it was just great to have him around, actually. And, just through something like that, and for him to be as sort of eye rolling, I guess, at what was going on as I was. So it was nice to feel that people hadn't forgotten me, that I was still loved, but not being, sort of
Overbearing.
completely overwhelmed
Right.
by people as well. And it was, literally, talk to me about anything other than what I'm actually going through. I mean, I'll talk to you about what I'm going through, but don't give me advice about what to eat or what to drink,
Oh
or
gosh.
what have you. I've had plenty of that from
Yeah.
from medical experts, and I know what I like, so I'm going to get on with it myself. It was it's that kind of thing that was
It's a, it's a,
helpful.
it's a nice, it's what I'm hearing from you, Tim, is you just liked knowing you had support, but also
Yeah,
we do as patients get unsolicited advice. People mean well, but it's like, don't
they
eat
do.
this, don't do that. Oh, maybe this is what happened,
Yeah,
So on that note, and I really appreciate all the time you spent with us. My last question to you is an open-ended one for a last message to the
sure.
people who are reading and watching this, and just whatever you'd like to say to people who are either newly diagnosed or in treatment, sort of still trying to figure things out.
Yeah. I mean, one of my bits of advice is don't give advice, um,
Maybe
but
maybe less advice and more like just your final sort of thoughts,
yeah.
going into.
I mean, it's th- I don't know. I've always tried to, I think life is what you make it, to a large extent, and the way that I've approached this all the way through is one of, curiosity. So it's about, I think, talking to the medical experts about what you've got, what the treatment options are, and trying to take that in. I mean, one of the things that I always took to appointments was my wife, so that she could make notes, and I made notes as well. And it's about using that interaction with the medical professionals to sort of, for me to understand as much as what was going on as possible, and then just trying to prepare yourself for each individual step. There's lots of good advice out there, so not only your own medical team, but say over in the UK, Lymphoma Action produce sort of excellent booklets and resources for people going through lymphoma and the various different types of lymphoma, and they act as a sort of patient support and patient advocate group as well. It's those sorts of organisations that are that really help, I think, patients actually get through the process. Certainly helped me get through the process.
Very good. I really appreciate you, Tim, sharing your perspective.
Sure.
Everyone has a different experience, even with the same diagnosis, but
Mm,
I think it is nice to be able to hear from people who've gone through the
yeah.
treatments, and have such a wonderful attitude like you do. I think it brings a light to the situation. So thank you. And, we'll put Tim's full story up on our platform as well, thepatientstory.com. But Tim, thank you for joining us. I really appreciate it.
You're very welcome, Stephanie.